European Union is preparing ways to respond if Trump imposes tariffs on EU-made cars.
With one bold move, Europe's largest economy executed what many are calling the most precise economic takedown in automotive history. No debates, no warnings, just action. Overnight, Germany blocked Tesla, Ford, and General Motors from all government contracts and subsidies. Within days, France imposed brutal new tariffs. Denmark turned Elon Musk into a political pariah. Then Canada joined the assault, and together they shut the doors on American dominance. This wasn't just a trade dispute. It was a coordinated, calculated power shift. So how did allies become economic enemies overnight? Why is the U.S. auto industry hemorrhaging jobs, contracts, and credibility? And has Made in America just been erased from the future of global transportation? What's happening? What began as scattered retaliation quickly became a catastrophic economic landslide. Within just 1 month of Germany's first policy announcement, the United States auto sector found itself locked out of its largest overseas market. A comprehensive analysis by the International Trade Council estimated that more than $219 billion and $500 million in American automotive exports were now at direct risk. That's not theoretical damage. That's measurable, immediate devastation. More than $110 billion worth of U.S.-made vehicles had been exported to Europe in the previous year alone. Those sales pipelines were now either fully severed or severely restricted due to tariffs, procurement bans, and public opinion collapse. For major automakers like Ford and General Motors, European markets had represented future growth and international legitimacy. Now, both companies reported emergency losses. General Motors issued a revised forecast predicting a $14 billion shortfall in projected overseas revenue. Ford warned investors of a $6 billion revenue contraction. Tesla's valuation plummeted as European institutional investors dumped shares in response to reputational and policy fallout. But this wasn't just a corporate bloodbath. Thousands of small and mid-sized parts suppliers, many of them in Michigan, Illinois, and Indiana, began filing for bankruptcy. Dealerships reported order cancellations in bulk. Container ships loaded with unsold EVs returned to American ports, where they were either remarketed at a loss or left to sit in holding yards. All while this happened, American leadership remained frozen. The tariffs that had triggered Europe's retaliation remained in place, and with no diplomatic resolution in sight, panic began to spread across the wider U.S. manufacturing sector. The European message had landed with surgical precision, and now the economic arteries of American auto were bleeding out. But while the European retaliation was coordinated, its consequences were just the beginning, because the next wave of destruction, it wouldn't come from across the Atlantic, it would come from within, and that's where the real collapse began. The Tariff Trap. When President Donald Trump signed the executive order imposing a 25% tariff on European vehicles and auto parts, he stood at a podium in Detroit, surrounded by Union flags and American-made pickup truck. He declared the move a win for American workers, promising to bring factories roaring back to life. But behind the applause and headlines was a ticking time bomb, and it exploded faster than anyone expected. For decades, the American auto industry had been globally entangled. Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis weren't just American companies, they were transnational ecosystems. Their factories in Michigan and Ohio relied on transmissions from Germany, batteries from France, software modules from Scandinavia, and critical metals from Eastern Europe. Slapping a 25% surcharge on those lifelines was not a show of strength. It was economic self-sabotage. Within days, procurement officers across Detroit's Big Three were in crisis mode. Contracts were frozen, shipments delayed, production costs soared. According to internal reports leaked by a Stellantis executive, the average cost of assembling a mid-range sedan rose by nearly $6,000 overnight. And it wasn't just luxury models or imports. This was hitting the core of America's working-class vehicle market. Ford's head of supply chain called it an engineered disaster. Parts that had cost $80 a unit now cost $105. Component delays stretched delivery schedules into chaos. Vehicles that were once built in 36 hours now took 64, and the assembly lines slower, smaller. And for the first time since the Great Recession, at risk of permanent shutdown, auto executives begged the White House for exemption. They cited national job loss, supply shock, and downstream effects that would ripple through the economy. But Trump refused to budge. In a tweet that same week, he wrote, "We're winning now. Don't let them fool you. America first." But on the factory floors, there were no winners, only silence, confusion, and growing fear. And then came the consumer response. Dealerships across the Midwest raised sticker prices by thousands. Buyers who had saved for a new F-150 or Chevy Equinox were suddenly priced out. Foot traffic fell, inventory piled up, sales collapsed. Within 3 weeks, dealers in 24 states reported the worst March numbers since 2009. What was supposed to be a patriotic shield turned out to be a corporate guillotine. Executives in Detroit stopped calling it a tariff. They called it what it was, a kill shot. And while allies turned on each other, the heartland of Trump's America began to feel the real pain, the Heartland Collapse. In counties that had once turned out in red caps and waving flags, there was now silent and pink slip. From Flint, Michigan to Kokomo, Indiana, the promise of protection had morphed into a nightmare. Ford announced the shuttering of 2 major assembly plants, eliminating over 15,000 jobs. General Motors followed with 12,000 layoffs. The ripple effect? Catastrophic. We sweat the details so you didn't have to. If you found value here, hit the subscribe button. These were not just job losses. These were lifeline severances in towns built around one employer, one factory, one future. In Lima, Ohio, a mother of 3 was told her job would be gone by June. In Bowling Green, Kentucky, welders lined up outside the unemployment office for the first time in over a decade. In Terre Haute, Indiana, churches opened soup kitchens, not for the homeless, but for laid-off auto workers. It wasn't just manufacturing jobs. With auto production stalled, thousands of small suppliers were blindsided. Plastics firms, paint shops, robotics providers, many of them family-run, began filing for bankruptcy. A report from the Midwestern Manufacturing Council showed that over 400 businesses had closed or downsized in just 5 weeks. Trump's economic team called it a temporary adjustment, but for those on the ground, it felt like betrayal. Local news anchors in Toledo called it a second Great Recession. Mayors held emergency press conferences, and in union halls once skeptical of the Democratic Party, workers began chanting for a reversal, not just of the tariffs, but of the presidency. But while the market crumbled, something far more calculated was taking shape across the Atlantic, and that's where the real power shift begins. Europe's Green Coup. When Germany, France, and Denmark retaliated against United States tariffs, most analysts assumed it was temporary, a political firestorm that would fizzle out once the dust settled. But Europe had no interest in a simple tit-for-tat exchange. Beneath the diplomatic outrage and media blitz was something far more calculated. The European Union didn't just want to respond to Washington's aggression. They wanted to rewrite the global electric vehicle economy from the ground up. The cornerstone of this transformation was the Green Mobility Acceleration Act, passed quietly in the early months of 2025. On paper, it looked like another environmental regulation, but its real purpose was to draw a permanent red line in the sand. If you want to sell electric vehicles in Europe, you now have to build them in Europe, with locally sourced parts, under strict sustainability benchmarks. The act didn't ban American cars outright, it simply made them irrelevant. Any vehicle manufactured outside the European Union, especially those assembled in the United States, was automatically disqualified from public fleet contracts, government rebates, and municipal transportation programs. That meant no tax incentives for Tesla buyers, no subsidies for Ford's electric cargo vans, and no place for General Motors in Europe's growing network of e-mobility corridors. This wasn't framed as retaliation, it was framed as resilience. European leaders declared that the continent had relied too heavily on foreign imports for too long. They promised to support local automakers, create green jobs, and lead the global transition to electric transportation. The message was crystal clear. American vehicles were no longer needed. Europe would build its own future, and the impact was immediate. French automaker Renault saw a 34% spike in domestic sales within 2 months of the law's passage. In Germany, Volkswagen rolled out an advertising campaign framed around sustainability without foreign interference. And in Denmark, where Tesla once led in electric vehicle sales, American brands were replaced almost overnight by homegrown alternatives. It wasn't a tariff war, it was an ecosystem shift. Europe had moved beyond retaliation and created a legal framework so robust, so future-focused that American companies couldn't even compete. And with one law, the European Union didn't just respond to the United States. They took the lead. But while Europe rebuilt the rules, one man's misstep made him the face of everything the continent rejected. From visionary to villain, the Musk Meltdown. Elon Musk was once the poster child of innovation in Europe. From Berlin to Copenhagen, he was hailed as the mind who made electric cars sexy and brought Silicon Valley swagger to climate-conscious cities. European governments rolled out red carpets for Tesla factories. Journalists gushed over his ability to disrupt legacy automakers. But that image is now ash in the wind. Musk's unraveling began not with a product failure, but with politics. In a now infamous interview on German television, Musk expressed support for the Alternative for Germany party, a far-right nationalist movement known for anti-immigration rhetoric and climate skepticism. The backlash was swift and merciless. German media dubbed him an American destabilizer. Protesters gathered outside Tesla's Berlin Gigafactory, holding signs that read, "No fascism in our future." But that was just the beginning. In France, Musk's public defense of Donald Trump's tariffs was interpreted not as loyalty, but as betrayal. French auto workers who had already lost contracts due to the shifting policy landscape saw Musk's comments as arrogant, dismissive, and disconnected from the real-world pain his alignment was causing. News anchors openly mocked him. Editorials questioned whether Tesla represented innovation or imperialism. In Denmark, the reaction was more methodical and far more damaging. Two of the country's largest pension funds, Academic Pension and Pension Denmark, announced they would fully divest from Tesla, citing ethical concerns. That meant billions of dollars in long-term investments pulled overnight. What followed was a series of cascading effects. Other funds across Europe began reviewing their Tesla holdings. Some blacklisted the stock entirely. Others issued public statements condemning Musk's political affiliation. The damage was not just financial, it was cultural. Tesla stores across Europe saw a massive decline in foot traffic. Canceled pre-orders flooded the company's customer service centers. Online forums became battlegrounds for angry consumers and former fans. Musk, once seen as a bold thinker, had become a toxic liability. And the real tragedy? It wasn't Tesla's technology that failed. It was its founder. Musk's personal brand, once the rocket fuel behind Tesla's global rise, had become the anchor dragging it down. But while Elon Musk was melting down on the public stage, something far bigger was taking shape behind closed doors: the anti-American trade axis. While the public fought over tariffs and Tesla, diplomats from Europe, Canada, and Mexico were meeting behind the scenes to forge a new global trade order, one that left the United States on the outside looking in. The European Commission quietly signed a trilateral agreement framework with Canada and Mexico. The goal? Establish a tariff-free corridor for electric vehicles, auto parts, and battery components across their 3 regions, with one major clause: no American-made materials or vehicles allowed. This was not just about punishing the United States. It was about building a new foundation for supply chain independence. By excluding U.S. product, the alliance ensured that even if the White House tried to dial back its aggressive tariffs, the damage would be permanent. America would no longer be a necessary part of the global auto ecosystem. The plan worked. Canadian and Mexican automakers immediately announced plans to expand domestic electric vehicle production. European companies opened joint venture talks in Quebec and Monterrey. The trade lanes that once flowed through Detroit began redirecting toward Montreal and Hamburg. In public, leaders used polite language about regional collaboration and resilient supply chain. But behind the scenes, this was a geopolitical realignment. The United States wasn't just being sidelined, it was being replaced. And as these trade networks grew stronger, something even more shocking emerged: the decision to build the future without a single US-made part. Cut out of the grid. Across Europe, North America, and parts of Asia, a new wave of legislation began taking hold. Nations were building clean vehicle infrastructure, charging stations, assembly plants, battery facilities, on the condition that nothing within them could originate from the United States. Not a chip, not a gearbox, not even a bolt. Why? Because trust had collapsed. The United States was no longer seen as a reliable partner. Its tariffs were erratic, its leadership unstable, its companies too politically entangled. And so the world began building without them. Denmark unveiled its Green Sovereignty Framework: 48 public EV charging hubs constructed using only European steel, Chinese semiconductors, and Canadian batteries. Germany expanded its manufacturing districts with a strict exclusion clause on US origin tech. Even Japan, a longtime ally, began modifying procurement standards to ensure compatibility with the new supply routes. The result was a new industrial grid that functioned perfectly. without the United States. This wasn't just retaliation, this was redesign. In every direction, America was being erased, not by war, not by protest, but by planning, and it was working. But while the global system adapted and evolved, back in America, something far more volatile was brewing, and it was about to explode into the street. The Labor Uprising. It began with silence. Then came the signs, handwritten, taped to factory gates, fluttering in the wind like warnings. Closed until further notice. No parts, no jobs, no future. In Detroit, the birthplace of American automotive power, the machines stopped humming. Workers stood outside with arms folded, faces grim. The United Auto Workers had voted, and the answer was loud, clear, and final. Walk out. For months, factory workers, port employees, and parts suppliers had watched the U.S. auto industry implode from the outside in. The tariffs, retaliations, and government decisions had crushed the industry they built with their hands. But while CEOs flew across the globe to beg for relief and shareholders panicked over collapsing portfolios, the workers were told to wait, to be patient, to trust the process. They did, and it failed them. On a cold Monday morning, over 300,000 auto workers walked off the job across 15 states. From Michigan to Indiana, Ohio to Kentucky, the picket line stretched for miles. What made this strike unprecedented was not just its size, but its spirit. This was not about a single plant, or a wage dispute, or even union politics. It was about betrayal. Workers held signs that read, "We built this, you broke it." And more pointedly, Trump promised, Trump lied. Within 72 hours, the movement spread. Port workers in New Jersey, California, and Louisiana joined in solidarity, refusing to load or unload any vehicles or auto parts destined for export. The supply chains froze, the highways grew quiet, and Washington realized too late this was no longer a trade war. It was a labor war. Across the Atlantic, something unprecedented happened. Labor unions in France and Germany, long known for their own militant strikes, issued formal declarations of solidarity with the United Auto Workers. In a rare show of international unity, they announced they would refuse to distribute or dock any American-made vehicles on European soil until the tariff policies were rescinded. In Denmark, transport unions took it even further, calling for a full embargo on Tesla shipments, stating that no vehicle built on broken promises should enter our ports. This wasn't coordination, it was combustion. Years of pent-up economic resentment, cultural disconnect, and broken industrial loyalty exploded into a movement that paralyzed the backbone of American manufacturing. And as the workers raised their voices, it became clear this was not just a strike, it was a reckoning. But while the workers rallied outside factories, inside boardrooms and stock exchanges, the damage took on a different form, one measured not in chants or picket signs, but in vanishing trillions, the trillion-dollar spiral. It began the moment the strike went national. On the morning following the United Auto Workers' announcement of an indefinite walkout, the Dow Jones Industrial Average opened nearly 800 points down. Analysts on CNBC scrambled for explanations. Hedge fund managers dialed into emergency calls. But by the time the closing bell rang, over $1.7 trillion in U.S. market value had already vanished. By the end of the week, that number would more than double. In just 48 hours, over $3.6 trillion in global market value evaporated. This was not a correction, it was an implosion. And it didn't stop at auto stocks. The shockwave slammed into the banking sector, insurance firms, consumer goods companies, and commodities markets. Construction firms tied to auto infrastructure saw their share prices halved. Pension funds began triggering sell-offs to meet liquidity obligations. And in cities like Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York, lines formed outside local branches of once secure regional banks. It wasn't just Wall Street, it was Main Street. Mortgage rates ticked upward as lenders scrambled to hedge against the crash. Grocery prices surged as fuel imports tangled in retaliatory tariff barriers. Car dealerships began preemptively slashing staff as inventory backlogs mounted. The ripple effects weren't ripples, they were shockwaves. In Frankfurt and Paris, global investors dumped U.S. assets at a historic pace. The dollar dipped, and credit default swaps on American corporate debt hit levels not seen since the financial crisis of 2008. Foreign media outlets ran headlines like, "Collapse in Detroit, Panic in New York." In Tokyo, the Nikkei opened nearly 5% down as Japanese automakers warned of permanent structural risk tied to U.S. instability. And at the epicenter of it all, the American auto industry. Ford's valuation dropped below $30 billion for the first time since 2012. General Motors halted dividend payments entirely. Tesla, still reeling from its collapse in Europe, saw its stock price crater another 17% in a single session, closing at its lowest point since 2020. The Federal Reserve scrambled to calm markets, issuing emergency statements and pausing rate hikes. But the message was clear. The damage had already been done, and unlike a typical market panic, this one had no quick fix. It was not a bubble, it was structural. Because when the factories go silent, the ports shut down, and the workers refuse to build, money disappears. Fast. But while Wall Street scrambled to stabilize and politicians issued press statements, something more elusive, more dangerous, began to erode public faith. The death of trust. You can rebuild a factory. You can restock inventory. You can even recover lost billions. But when consumers stop believing in your brand, when the public turns its back, that's a scar that never fully fades. Across the United States, the great emotional unraveling was underway. For more than a century, American automakers weren't just companies. They were symbols. Ford wasn't just a car maker. It was freedom on four wheels. General Motors wasn't just an employer. It was the engine of the middle class. Tesla wasn't just a tech company, it was the future. Consumer sentiment surveys from the Pew Research Center revealed something that chilled Detroit more than any export ban. More than 65% of Americans said they no longer trusted U.S. automakers to build affordable, reliable vehicles. Among millennials and Gen Z, that number climbed to over 78%. The reasons were as emotional as they were economic: betrayal, abandonment, arrogance. Buyers who once dreamed of owning a Tesla were now tweeting images of canceled orders, citing ethical concerns, anti-labor sentiment, or simply distrust in Elon Musk's leadership. In rural towns, former Ford loyalists described the closures of local plants as the last straw. Young professionals in cities opted for imported hybrids and scooters, saying, "I'll never support them again." This wasn't about price. This wasn't about specs. It was about identity. The collapse of trust was generational, ideological, and visceral. Even dealerships felt it. Once packed with families shopping for their first car, showrooms stood empty. Sales reps, once proud to pitch American strength, now avoided questions about layoffs and stock plunges. And worse, some began jumping ship, seeking employment with rising European or Asian brands. For the first time in modern American history, the cultural bond between automaker and consumer was broken. And it wasn't just at home. International consumers now viewed American vehicles as unstable products from an unstable country. Trade magazines in France and Germany stopped including U.S. models in their buyers' guides entirely. Canadian car shows replaced Tesla exhibits with local startups. In Denmark, online forums began tracking which vehicles were ethically safe to buy, with every U.S. model falling short. And in this atmosphere of alienation, one devastating question began to circulate, not among traders or executives, but among ordinary Americans. If trust is gone, if jobs are gone, if global allies are gone, what exactly is left? No way back. There are moments in history when decline is slow, invisible, a tide you don't feel rising until your feet are already underwater. But this wasn't one of those moments. This collapse was sudden, violent, public. And when it was over, what remained wasn't a weakened auto industry. It was something far more hollow, a shell. In boardrooms, they tried to reframe the situation. Temporary downturn, said Ford's chief financial officer. Rebalancing phase, claimed a Tesla spokesperson. But for the millions of Americans who had lost their jobs, their pensions, their towns, there was no sugarcoating it. The industry was gone, and it wasn't coming back. Auto manufacturing in America had once rested on three sacred pillars: mass production, global distribution, and consumer trust. All three were shattered. Supply chains that had taken decades to optimize were now fractured beyond recognition. Assembly lines once powered by pride now stood idle, collecting dust and rust. Small towns that had revolved around single plants faced extinction-level economic events. And even as stimulus programs were proposed and incentives debated, the truth loomed. No policy could bring back what had been lost. Investors were gone. Consumers had moved on. And globally, America was no longer seen as the leader of anything, least of all, innovation. Even the World Trade Organization, long considered an American stronghold, convened a special session to debate sanctions against the United States for violating trade norms. And for the first time in its history, the majority of members opposed Washington's position. At home, a generational shift in identity was taking place. The working class, once the backbone of America's industrial might, no longer saw itself reflected in national policy. The youth no longer saw American brands as aspirational. The middle class no longer saw buying American as practical. And as political debates raged over what went wrong, who to blame, what to fix, one truth echoed through the silence. So where does this leave us? The factories are quiet, the trust is broken, and America's auto empire, once unstoppable, is now in free fall. But the bigger question isn't just what happened, it's what comes next. Let us know what you think in the comments. Did the US auto industry bring this collapse on itself? Or was it sabotage from the outside? And if you found this breakdown worth your time, hit that subscribe button. This story is just the beginning.